Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to the monthly community call of our Chartres Academy as we prepare ourselves for our gathering each year in the first week of July this year, 2019. We're going to be meeting between the 7th and the 13th of July. And we're going into our 14th year, which means that we're completing our second cycle of the 7 liberal arts. And we'll be delving into the very profound final liberal art of astronomica. As we get started, we want to, as we always do, ask Apila Colorado, one of our clan mothers and founders with me and others of the Chartres Academy back in 2006, to provide us with our invocation. Apila?
Yeah, good morning, Jim. Good morning, Chartres community. I'm lighting the cedar from the hill of Chartres, by way of purifying and blessing this gathering, this community. Ancestors, Great Spirit, we look to you today for the return of our mystical vision. In the ordinary, with your grace, we perceive you, the extraordinary. Through the study of these moments, these insights, seeing beyond the shadow of the cave wall, there's a light behind. We give thanks for this capacity within us. We look to it now as we turn to the stars and the study of the stars with the help of our guest speaker today, Dr. Rick Tarnas, who's given his life to understanding the extraordinary through the hieroglyphs of the movements and the patterns of the stars and the heavens and the way we relate to that. Thank you again for Ubiquity University, for this community, and may this call, this virtual assemblage of fire, water, wind, of spirit, of earth, may we all unite in a way that furthers the creation, and may we remember through this unveiling our original creation story for this time. Mama, ua noa.
Thank you, Apila, and thank you all for joining us. I want to note that this is the first time we're going out live on Facebook. So for all of you that are joining through Facebook, I want to welcome you. And I also want to welcome all of you who are joining through Zoom. For those of you who may be joining for the first time, we have this kind of call once a month. And we've been doing this now for 14 years. And because every year, the first week of July, we meet in Chartres and go into a 7-day initiatory ritual and process as we deeply contemplate one of the 7 liberal arts. Several weeks ago, I sent out a letter to our entire Chartres community and Ubiquity and Wisdom School community, saying that the course coming up in Chartres could be one of the most important opportunities any of us have had for some time to understand more deeply the gravity and the potential of our age. We all know that the world is in crisis. We know that climate change is spinning out of control. We know that there are a spectrum of global issues that are worsening because the international community is not paying sufficient attention. There's one country that the world looks to lead. And that country is now led by a man who doesn't even believe in climate change, who is corrupt beyond measure, and seems, over the last several weeks, to actually be gaining the upper hand. So how we understand what is happening, not only historically, not only culturally, politically, as the fate of the United States, which for nearly 250 years has been a beacon of light to the rest of the world about what democracy can mean, is now wrestling with its soul. And it's not altogether clear whether the rule of justice, the rule of law, the democratic process will prevail, or whether the United States, like many countries past and even present, will be consumed by the raw exercise of power and deceit, with implications that will literally reverberate around the world. At this time, we're gathering together in Chartres as we go into a deep deliberation of the seventh liberal art on astronomica, which is the study of how the cosmos affects history, how the macro and the micro mutually inform and affect one another. How our history now unfolds will determine the fate of all Americans, but the fate of the earth itself. Because if we go too much longer without solving the critical global problems that are staring us right in the face, irretrievable damage could be done. And I might just point out that tomorrow, on Monday, the Extinction Rebellion started last year in the UK, is calling for an international day of action. And Ubiquity is standing with the people all over the world that are calling for our leaders to wake up and to take action. So today we're asking Rick Tarnas to appear for a second time. He'll be the lead faculty in Chartres, along with Linda Tucker and several others, to speak to us about Trump's natal chart and the chart of the United States of America. Countries have charts. So that as we prepare our time in Chartres, now only several months hence, we can begin to deepen the quality of our dialogue. So Rick will talk with us for about 20, 25 minutes. He'll be sharing his screen so that you can see the different charts that he'll be putting up. And then we'll have questions and answers. If you want to make a comment or you want to ask a question right there on the bottom of your screen, you can just, you see a little hand, you can just click there and you can raise your hand and then we'll call on you. And I would say in advance that the purpose of this exercise is to understand so that we can be empowered. Because history is not written until we write it. It's being written now. and to the degree to which we can empower ourselves and come together with all those others of similar concern around the world to take action to support the human future, we can still secure the salvific fate of our civilization and the earth itself. That's what's at stake. And that's why, Rick, I just want to thank you for coming. Rick Tarnas, as you know, from if you've read his Cosmos and Psyche or Passion of the Western Mind, he's one of the great thinkers of our time, easily the great astrologer of our time. So to have him with us to share his wisdom is a high honor. Thank you for joining us, Rick.
Thank you, Jim. That's for an overly generous introduction and appraisal, which I won't subscribe to, but thank you for the kind words. And Apila, thank you so much for your eloquent invocation today. It's really kind of sets a sacred context for what we do. And I think Jim has also done an excellent job in setting the context just in terms of the drama of our historical moment. It's a drama with so many aspects. It's an ecological, existential drama. It's a spiritual one, existential both in that more spiritual sense as well as in the more biological and geological sense. And finally, it's also a moral threshold that we're crossing. And the advantage of doing the kind of exploration that we'll be doing today, which is just within a short time that we have, but during this time we can kind of set out some headlines, nothing that could be adequate to the depth and complexity of the reality, but one can certainly give some illuminating headlines that could be helpful here as we go forward. And the advantage of doing that, helpfulness comes from the fact that, you know, as the whole history of depth psychology, of which, say, Carl Gustav Jung would really be the especially crucial foundational figure. I mean, behind is a whole history of esoteric insight, but also just in terms of depth psychology. You got William James and Freud and Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff and many others that have laid the foundations for basically getting a glimpse into the powerful unconscious archetypal powers or forces, complexes that live in our psyche, not only as individuals as we make our way through our private life and our individual careers and relationships and so forth, but also these powerful forces are at work in the collective psyche. And this is something that Jung saw very early, and he also saw very early that there were remarkable connections between what happens was happening to his patients in the privacy of their own psyche and in their lives, connection between that and the movements of the heavens, and the study of the individual birth charts gave a real insight from his perspective very early on. He recognized that this allowed us to see which archetypal forces, which and in what combinations were being constellated at a given time, and that this was helpful for understanding both the individual and the collective. So we'll kind of be we'll be basically drawing on that that tradition of insight. I won't give any more background on the origins of the kind of archetypal, cosmological, and astrological perspective and methods that have evolved over the years within the world community of astrologers. But instead, I'll just leap right into the study that we're doing right today. I want to make clear that what we're doing here is not it is not at all. We're not looking at concrete prediction. This isn't like forecasting in some simplistic, predictive, deterministic way. That's not how I believe astrology works. I don't think it's how it certainly isn't how it helps us. In fact, it can be wounding when it is used in that kind of fatalistic way. This is about archetypal insight. It's about deepening our understanding and in many ways giving us more capacity to co-creatively participate in the expression of these life-giving, but also potentially destructive, depending on how they are deployed, energies that are at work in all of us and in the world today. And we have to watch out when we do this kind of analysis, as we look at what's going on now, or as we look at the immediate future. We have to be very careful about not projecting our fears and our wishes in a way that obscures our insight. And we also have to be aware of that impulse that comes so readily to us to try to control things rather than participate co-creatively in them. We're not in a simplistic way the captains of our ship, yet in some sense the unfolding of history and the unfolding of reality calls on us to exercise our agency, our moral insight, our courage, our intelligence, our capacity for discernment. It calls on us to do this. And one of the ways it allows us to do this more skillfully, I believe, is the remarkable correlation between above and below, between the movements of the planets in the solar system, the patterns of the stars of the heavens, the correlation between those and the patterns, particularly the archetypal patterns of human experience and human affairs. I don't see this as being a simplistic causal thing. It's much more a synchronistic patterning of meaning that goes up from the heavens to the earth, from above and below, but also inner and outer, macro and micro, as Jim referred to. So, and in this study, what we have found, many of us who've been doing this for years, what seems to be the most powerful way of getting us the most essential underlying principles that are at work astrologically seem to be understood in terms of the movements of the outer planets relative to the Earth. These seem to be of the greatest importance when it comes to understanding the collective psyche and the great historical epochs and patterns of history. To get a handle on what's happening right now, the most important, I think, the correlation that is most outstanding and that allows us to get a glimpse on the big picture is the fact that for the last 12 years or so, we have, and for another 2 to 3 years, we have been going through a powerful alignment of Uranus and Pluto, two of the planets that Dane Ridger called the ambassadors of the galaxy. They're at the boundary line of the solar system, and in some sense they seem to operate archetypally in such a way as to open us beyond the narrow horizons of the egoic, of the self-centered, of the provincial, and to move towards the more universal and towards a wider consciousness. But they can be very demanding. And this Uranus-Pluto alignment, this is the first major dynamic alignment between these two planets since the 1960s, when they were in conjunction from 1960 to 1972. And we again have right now what's called a square alignment, 90-degree aspect alignment between these two planets. This would be like moving from the new moon to halfway to the full moon, which would be the opposition. We're at the square, halfway. And that is a period, approximately 12 to 14 years of that tends to be very much shaped by the archetypes that work here. And Uranus is the principle of change, of the unexpected. It has when it gets constellated, we tend to see periods of accelerated change, of an impulse for overturning the status quo, innovation, rapid technological advance, and disruption. Movements for reform are very strong, for emancipation, but there's a trickster quality to it. It tends to be very unpredictable. Large demographic changes tend to take place. There can be the impulse for change can go either what would be called either from the left or the right, and in addition, you have, when you have Pluto in combination with Uranus, Pluto's energy is in some sense is coming from the volcanic depths of the archetypal underworld of the depths of nature, of the earth, of the psyche, of the id, and it's in terms of the gods at work here, we could think of Shiva, Kali, Dionysus, Hades, Pluto. These are the powerful gods of nature, of transformation, of destruction and regeneration, transformation. And whenever Pluto comes into alignment with any other planet, it tends to tremendously compel, intensify whatever it touches. In this case, Uranus, that principle of change, of movement towards the new, towards overturning the past, a certain restlessness and excitement and unpredictability, like what's going to happen next, sense of uncertainty. And you put these two planets together in archetypal terms, these tend to be sustained periods of tremendous revolutionary transformation and disruption, impulse to transform the world, it tends to empower. As we trace back the great Uranus, the patterns through the great Uranus-Pluto periods, the French Revolutionary epoch, 1787 to 98, the 1840s and 50s when revolutions swept Europe and China, India, the Middle East. These are all periods of tremendous empowerment of those who have not been empowered, but it can also move into violence. It's an unleashing of non-specific elemental energy that can take a multivalent range of forms. And this is where human agency comes in, because you see this in periods systematically. It coincides with periods of the empowerment of women, the civil rights movement of the 60s, the Black Lives Matter movement of our own time, the women's emancipation that was at such sweeping consequence coming out of the 60s and early 70s, and then again now clearly throughout the world, a tremendous sense of the rising of the impulse for empowerment of women in so many ways. Not, I mean, politically, socially, in commerce, morally, etc. The Me Too movement and so forth. In addition, however, this can unleash, because of the plutonic connection to the depths and to the id, the instinctual energies that can go in a range of ways. You also see this kind of unleashing of a collective id energy that can be like mob energy. It can be, we saw it in the 60s, whether it was the Chinese Cultural Revolution or even on the streets, and whether it was the police or the protesters. Anti-war movements would and demonstrations could easily flip over into the violent. Of course, the French Revolution is a paradigm version of that. And so these are periods of great upheaval, great potential for transformation of a progressive character, and yet at the same time, it has perilous qualities too. And sometimes, like the technological advances of periods like this, get intertwined with the social political impulses, for good or ill, which we clearly see at work today, whether it's the way social media or computers or artificial intelligence, mass media can affect things for good or ill. So that's in the background. Now, what I haven't mentioned is that the last time that Uranus and Pluto were square, that is the time before the 60s, before it moved into the conjunction, it had a square alignment prior to that, which was the 1930s, from 1928 to 1937. And this period, I mean, you may remember, it's the period of the New Deal here in the United States, Roosevelt, et cetera. And again, we have the calling for the new Green Deal that would, in a sense, expand the progressive legislative impulse to include the rights of the earth and the saving of the planet, but as well as social justice and economic justice. But as we know, throughout the world, and including in the States, this was also a period of a kind of unleashing of demagogic and neo-fascist, or fascist in the original form, but now neo-fascist mob energies, authoritarian governments, etc. So in some ways, our period right now, which we've been going through for over over a decade, and we still got 2-3 more years of this superpowered energy saturating the system. We have in a sense, a kind of choice between what we think of as the positive side of the 60s, for many of us perhaps listening today, the part of the counterculture and so forth, with that progressive idealism and so forth. A choice between the 60s and the 30s in its more destructive unleashing of the deep shadow. Now, speaking of the shadow, Jim has brought up the fact that it's probably more evident in a kind of especially influential way in the United States. I mean, of course, it's sweeping the world. It's in Brazil. It's in Russia. It's in China. It's in Hungary, and so forth. It's Syria, Saudi Arabia. But there is a kind of pivotal place that the United States does play, a role that it plays, and that shadow has really been unleashed very potently after 8 years of having an African-American progressive president who represents that other side of this Uranus-Pluto energy. We have had the flip side of this more authoritarian, amoral demagoguery that with absolute kind of destructive consequences for the planet and for human individuals. What I'm going to do here with is now share the screen with you, because what we'll do first, what I'm going to show you is where the planets are right now. That would be called the world transits that we're all sharing. Then I will show you what's happening in America, the United States chart, using the traditional date that astrologers have found to be most relevant for this kind of study, namely July 4th, 1776. And then we will look at the chart of Donald Trump, who is in some sense he's like the very image of the kind of unleashing of that shadow energy that he carries and expresses. I think when he was first running for president, I thought of him as being kind of like the shadow of the Republican Party being revealed. Now it's pretty clear he's also the shadow of the United States. He also reveals the shadow of males, the shadow of whites, the shadow of really of also of wealth, and the shadow of human beings, in how Homo sapiens has, in some sense, in its modern form, objectified the rest of the world for its own self-enhancement and to the destructive consequences for all. So in that way, this awakening of the shadow tends to be quite characteristic with the transits we're going through, both the Uranus square Pluto, but also what I haven't yet mentioned, the Saturn conjunct Pluto, that is a shorter 3 to 4 year transit of tremendous significance for us right now, which I'll bring out in a couple of moments. So I'm going to just share my screen and bring up the chart here of the world transits right now. Let me see if we got it here. Okay. Can everybody see this okay? Maybe just nod your head, Jim or Banachet. Yeah, great. Okay, so what I want you to look at first is, this is Pluto right here. You can see it's right next to Saturn. I'm happening to do this, from here in California. So the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, if you're looking at this on the East Coast, would have moved down here, but they would still be right next to each other, Saturn and Pluto. All these, the relationship between all these planets would be consistent throughout the world, but just in a different place relative to the horizon. Okay, so here we're in the mid-morning, and you can see the sun is up here. Here's where it would be at dawn, but here it's up here, and it's not far from Uranus. That's Uranus, that principle of change, of the disruption of the past, of the status quo, the movement towards the future, and an impulse towards rebellion and a restlessness to break out of any constrictions and so forth. But it's been in a square, that's what these red lines are, a 90-degree square relationship with Pluto. You can see it's getting towards the end of the 10-degree orb here, but it's still going to be within it for the next couple of years. And in fact, towards the end of these periods, it tends to be quite potent indeed, because it's kind of the archetypal complex has saturated the collective psyche and tends to be quite potent. But then you also have this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and Saturn is the principle of contraction, of it on the positive side gives an impulse towards greater focus, concentration, discipline, foundation building, rigor, but it also is the very principle of limit. It's the reality principle. It tends to bring things to a head where they have to be faced. In some sense, it's the very archetype of problems, of dealing with what's been suppressed as a problem tends to come to the surface. This conjunction came strongly within orb over a year ago, and it will continue for another 2.5 years or so. It tends to coincide with periods of great historical it's when the rubber meets the road. It's when the chickens come home to roost. All these kind of cliched expressions that describe a great need to really confront what may have been suppressed and face the difficult realities. Often it's a period of judgment. Often scandals come to the surface. Trials, major trials. Watergate happened under it. The Nuremberg trials happened under the conjunction of 46 to 48. It can be a period where of greater limits of resources. Sometimes economies can go into recession or sometimes depression. And so, but it also gives a great potential for moral courage and fortitude, determination to, it tends to be, it has a kind of unremitting demand on us to, it has a kind of unflinching quality that it requires of us. And if we meet these challenges during such a period, it tends to set create a structure that endures. Things that happen during these periods tend to really last for a long time in their influence, in their consequences. But it is a period of true gravity, gravitas. There's a seriousness in the air, and there's a quality of kind of existential contraction. I mean, everybody I know in my world, and I'm married to a Jungian analyst, therapist, and had dinner with several analysts last night, and universally they describe how all their patients basically are feeling with increasing, and I mean it's been coming over, especially the last couple of years, but with increasing intensity, this sense of a kind of compression in their lives, and having to meet obstacles and delays and problems, but also a kind of tangible the demands of aging, the demands of jobs, of responsibilities, of duties, karma, that type of weightiness tends to be much more evident during these times. Okay, now I want us to now look at, first quickly, the US chart. I'm not going to say a lot about the chart by itself, but you can just see here's where the planets were on July 4th, 1776, in relationship to each other. And when many feel this is very close to the time of the exact signing of the Declaration of Independence. There with Uranus, you can see right at the horizon setting there in the west. But what I want you to see is, those of you who are astrologers can readily interpret this, but I'm going to show you what we now are looking at is a biwheel, where the world transits that we were looking at they're on the outside here, have been superimposed on the natal chart of the United States. What you can see here is that for the first time in the history of the United States, Pluto has returned. See, Pluto, that's where it was when the US was begun. Here's where Pluto is now. It takes as many years as the US has been in existence for Pluto to go around the entire birth chart, as it were. That's because Pluto has that long, 240 plus years of for its revolution to take place. And so we're going through what is called the Pluto return. No human being ever goes through a Pluto return. We don't live that long, but collectively, our country is going through it. And this brings up basically all the Plutonic themes, including facing the underworld of power, for example, facing the shadow, going through tremendous depths of transformation with both destructive possibilities and regenerative possibilities. This is the archetype of death and rebirth. And as you can see, Saturn has joined Pluto here in the sky today, and over this 3 to 4 year period we're in right now, and it is moving right onto this natal Pluto. This is a very tight alignment. It's interesting that in 2016, when Trump was, let's say, semi-elected, he didn't win the popular vote, that's for sure, but he nevertheless, this is a good example of how the shadow that was built into the US Constitution from the beginning, with the Electoral College, the accommodation of the slaveholding states, and all sorts of factors that went into the reality that we do not have one person, one vote in our aspiring democracy here today. How that came to roost in 2016. And when in November 2016, the election happened, Pluto was tightly opposite the sun. So Pluto was back here a little bit, opposite the sun, and square Saturn. That's would have, so the Pluto opposite sun, that's like a several year transit by itself, where there often is, when individual goes through something like that, they on the one hand, there can be kind of the presence coming into one's life of the Plutonic, which can take the form of like often a solar male figure who is very power oriented and can in some sense also represent the dark side. It's a danger with it, at the same time as it has tremendous potential for empowerment in a positive way. But that's one way of looking at the United States position right now, what we've been going through the last 3 years. If you think of Pluto as Hades, the underworld, and the god of the underworld. And Pluto, in some sense, you could say, abducted the soul of America, and Persephone, and brought it into the underworld. And I think everyone with a certain degree of moral clarity has recognized over these last years of the Trump administration how much a shadow that has been under the surface and was there has just been completely brought up to the surface, or we've been abducted down into it, so that on a daily basis we face awful, morally revolting realities, whether it's the treatment of women, or the treatment of immigrants, or the treatment of animals and plants, and the state of the world and other countries, etc. A kind of will to power has been unleashed and revealed itself in a naked way. This, I should say that, as any good Jungian analyst or depth psychologist would tell you, this is also a tremendous opportunity for, in facing the shadow, bringing it to the surface, we have a potential for psychological insight and moral transformation that is not possible as long as one doesn't face that shadow. And in some sense, this shadow has been more pressed to the surface than ever. And I think in certain ways constellated a will to transformation that is extraordinarily needed in our time. So here, finally, I'm going to just look at Trump's chart. Look at how he's born with the Sun-Uranus conjunction opposite the moon. Many things could be said about this, but he has a certain genius that is typical of the Sun-Uranus. Also an unpredictability, tremendous restlessness. He doesn't, his attention span is about 2.4 seconds. But there is a kind of, a kind of genius of a malefic type, and this is trine Jupiter. Jupiter, that planet of expansiveness, of growth, of good fortune, of wealth, etc. All his life, certain things just kind of fall into his lap with unusually. This is in certain ways a chart that is highly favored in many ways. Now he has Mars rising. It's a warrior energy. It's also aggressive. There, that impulse to rage. Broad conjunction up there with Pluto, etc. All these things we will go into in much more detail at chart, including understanding both the archetypes in general and our historical moment. But I want to use the last couple minutes here of our time together to point out where that Saturn-Pluto conjunction is in the sky relative to Donald Trump's chart. Notice that this Saturn-Pluto is exactly opposite Trump's Saturn, his Saturn-Venus conjunction, actually. That Saturn-Venus conjunction, the shadow form of that he embodies so much is his constant, that kind of cold-heartedness. Venus as the heart, and Saturn can contract, constrict it. But Saturn's also the judge, the measurer of beauty. Venus and his constant, really despicable, kind of measuring judgments of women and women's beauty in his assessment and so forth. The beauty pageants that he manipulated, etc. But anyway. He's got that Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposite Saturn. This is he's had this Pluto opposite Saturn really for the whole time he's been in office. And Uranus in the earlier, when he first came in, was squaring the Saturn. And so he's, I think, felt claustrophobically kind of besieged from the time he came into the presidency. And there is a, you know, the sense of judgment and of you know, potential defeat lingers around him at all times with transits like this, and the possibility is there still of, I mean, these many indictments that are being explored right now and investigated. So that's happening there. But notice this faster moving transit, Jupiter going right across his Sun Uranus opposite the moon. That tends to bring in a sudden like happy news, good fortune, such as what his Attorney General Barr did with the Mueller report, and his current sense of having just escaped that crisis, though much more is going on. Everything's different now that we have a democratically controlled House of Representatives. So maybe I'll just say one other thing about his natal chart before we go, and that is, I'm just going to show you this natal chart by itself. See this Mercury, which is communication, the logos, how we think, how we communicate, how we take in and impart information, the messenger of the gods. His Mercury is square Neptune, very tight, that Mercury square Neptune. And that's the potential downside of the Mercury-Neptune aspect when it's in a square like that is a tendency to prevaricate, to lie, to deceive, to be self-deceptive, to live in a self-deceptive, illusory, you know, bubble, but also to, in some sense, believe one's own deceptions, which makes them all the more effective, as he has been. Actually, Ronald Reagan had the Mercury-Neptune hard aspect as well, and he would just believe. He actually seemed to believe when he was saying that he was there liberating the concentration camps, when he told the German minister that, when in fact he had never left the United States during the war. He'd been in Hollywood, but he'd seen the movies. Anyway, these are some of the things that we can see at work in Trump's chart. It's a very telling chart, and his transits are very pivotal right now. It can go a number of ways. I think, yeah, my own personal sense, to sum up where we're at right now, is that this is a period of which you don't need astrology to tell you, just of evolutionary importance of the highest order on every level, you know, moral, biological, ecological, political, and everything is kind of coming to a head. We're going through, it's both a death contraction and a birth contraction. And I think the cosmos has been bathing us in its meaning. It helps us see the meanings that are at work, and the archetypal forces that are at work. And in doing so, it allows us to recognize through this lens of astronomica and archetypal astrology that's kind of been bestowed to us, we, I think, have the privilege of being able to have insight into what's at stake, what energies are at work right now, how we can co-creatively participate in their expression so that we can bring forth their most progressive and life-enhancing consequences. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim right now. I think I took a bit more than 30 minutes. I'm sorry, for that, but hopefully it wasn't time wasted.
Well, this is quite extraordinary. It's this notion that we are witnessing the Pluto return of the United States, to me, explains so much. And this image that you just left us with, Rick, of we're simultaneously experiencing a death contraction and a birth contraction. That is quite extraordinary. So I'm going to open it up to any questions or comments anybody wants to make. Let's start with you, Banafshe. And as Banafshe's making her comment and asking her question, any of you that would like to speak, please just raise your hand.
I just mentioned Jim, and perhaps Banafshe will be doing this, but a couple of the questions have already been posted there on that list, which I can see. But go ahead, Banafshe.
Well, if you would like to answer those, Rick, please go ahead.
Sure. So the first one from Lenita mentions that Lawrence Hillman, he's a good friend of mine. He's the son of James Hillman, one of the great archetypal psychologists of our lifetimes, and also a good friend who passed away a few years ago. Lawrence Hillman talks about Pluto as also expressing the dark feminine, which surely has many hopeful implications for the upcoming years. Can you comment? Yes, I mean, Pluto, I mentioned Kali. Pele, for example, is another expression of Pluto in its feminine form. All the archetypes have both feminine and masculine inflections or aspects, and there's one of the things I didn't mention, but is relevant in responding to this good question, is that as one tracks the history of how these different planetary alignments have coincided with the sequence of periods in history that manifest those energies, it is quite striking how there has been a tangible or a discernible arc of the moral universe. In other words, the same archetypal energies as it moves from the 1930s to the 1960s to the present, even though as one gets closer to the light, one also constellates the shadow with equal force. There has been a tangible ethical, moral evolution. Think about how, when we look at the 1960s, something like Mad Men, and see how women were, remember just how women were treated then, and then come to now and recognize how unacceptable so many of those things were. And at the same time, like the Me Too movement, bringing up even more the shadow of powerful male behavior that helps us see it, judge it, and transform. This is the empowerment of women has been every time Uranus and Pluto have come into major aspects, starting in the French Revolution and the vindication of the rights of women by Mary Wollstonecraft, the great progenitor of feminist awareness in the modern era in many ways, has been consistently happening. And this is the most vivid expression ever in our own time across the world. I think we do have a moral evolution that is tangibly happening, and that the expression of the empowerment of the feminine is indeed implied by the presence of the Plutonic. But there's also a great shadow side to whether it's masculine or feminine Plutonic energies, and Anne Baring has spoken very eloquently about it in one of her earlier times with us here. Let me also do the other question that's here from Kelly. Have you looked at the charts of the current Democratic candidates? And if so, can you see who would be most beneficial for the Earth and, in short, the feminine empowerment? You know, I've begun to look. I mean, there are now 18 Democratic candidates who have declared for the presidency, and I've looked at a number of them, but certainly not all. Let me hasten to say that there is, you cannot, you can get a tremendous amount by looking at a birth chart. What you cannot see is the moral vector, the level of consciousness and impulse towards the life enhancing versus the more destructive or more narcissistic. You can't tell that by looking at a birth chart. Adolf Hitler's chart and Charlie Chaplin's charts were almost identical. They were born so close to each other, and they had lots of similarities in their chart. I mean, in their lives, archetypally, including both being the great dictator in totally different forms. You know, artists, geniuses of communication who created vast illusions that affected, you know, influenced millions. But what a different moral vector. So I think, I mean, as the campaign progresses and different ones rise to the surface, to greater prominence, we'll be able to get, you know, comment more usefully. But it's a little early right now to be making those kinds of assessments, and keeping in mind that one can never really you should never look at a birth chart and then make some predictive comment about what this person is capable of or not. That's the beauty of cosmic creativity and of human personhood, is that we're in an open universe, and every human being has autonomy within different limits, but our capacity to bring forth our best moral nature is not predicted by the birth chart. It's forged in our individual souls, moment to moment.
Rick, there was a related question around Trump's chart. In his progress chart, do you see any light entering his life, given the changing planetary alignments?
Now, I don't know if the person was talking about the, we were looking at the transits to his chart. The progress chart is actually another form of a very valid and useful form of tracking the changing archetypal energies in a person's life, and he's actually coming up to a new moon that is a sun-moon conjunction in his progress chart that's going right across his Mars ascendant. I mean, he's likely to be pretty volatile, but during this time, but that's kind of his signature anyway. But I think that there is, I mean, these next 2 years are pivotal, very dramatic. In his chart, his transits could hardly be more focused. He's it could go both ways. There's, you know, these conjunctions are multivalent, but yeah, I don't hold out a lot. I mean, even though I think ultimately every person's redeemable, it may take more than one lifetime though, and I am not especially hopeful that he's going to go through a radical moral regeneration during these next couple of years, but one can never tell.
And then there's a final question, I think.
I will address, can I read that question? Because that ties in with what I wanted to say, and I think we're at the end. Hi everyone, I'm Banafshe, and I will be also a faculty in Chartres. And exactly the question that is, the two questions that Paolo has written here is what we will be addressing in Chartres. Part of what we're doing is informing ourselves of the current situation, current extremes that we're experiencing, and also delving into the great potential of this time, as Rick was telling us, the great potential, the great birthing potential, which we will be exploring through really harnessing the energy of the location. As many of you know, the Chartres Cathedral, where it sits, the hill of the Chartres Cathedral, from the pre-Christian times, 3,500 years ago, the Druids and the Celts, they intuited the energy of potential, of great potential in the land. And they fashioned a Black Madonna that represented this energy, this perpetually expectant maiden. So this constant potential for transformation, for renewal, is what the location is about. And we want to really harness this energy and together, collectively, come into recognizing that we have the potential to change things. We really have the potential to change and create the world that we want to live in, and the world that we want the next generations to live in harmony with the greater Earth community. And the question that I had for Rick was, what is the, the constellation of the time we're in Chartres that will actually also help us realize this aim of coming together as a collective and energetically influencing. But I think we're at the end of our time. I don't know, Rick, if you want to say anything about this.
I could just say in a single sentence that the time chosen for our week together in Chartres, in some sense, brings the sun is going to be going right across the parts of the alignment that we've been talking about of the outer planets. So that tends to, okay, think about the sun. It illuminates whatever it touches. And that's in some ways what we're going to be seeking to do there, is bringing our consciousness to using our solar light to illuminate these deep mysteries and to bring greater awareness to it. So in a nutshell, the time's been selected in a way to help us see these archetypal powers with greater focus than ever.
Thank you so much. And just to add, we will be doing, in the afternoons, we will be whirling, and we will meditate. We will do sound baths and prayer and singing, activities that connect our brain and our hearts, so that we can access the greater potential that is in our hearts. We will speak more about that next month, of how these activities induce the heart and brain connection that actually activate the potential that we have to make the transformation that we're invited to step into at this time.
Well, listen, thank you all. Just before I turn it back to Banafshe for final benediction, I want to thank you, Rick, and also to say to everyone, what Rick has laid out today is just profound. And that was in 60 minutes. Imagine being in Chartres, one of the most extraordinary places of transformation and illumination, as it will be constellated while we're there, and have 7 days to really engage deeply in understanding, building community, and empowering ourselves both communally and individually for what we need to do as citizens of the global polity. I've said in a couple of communications, we want as many people to be there as possible. If there are any of you that just would love to come, but you're financially challenged in some way, or you need some things worked out, please be in touch with Stacy, our registrar, or send me an email, or Banavshay, and we'll work it out. Because this conversation is crucial. This is probably the conversation that we all need to be having right now on planet Earth in 2019, because these next 2 years are going to perhaps be determinative as to how the rest of our lives and the destiny of the United States and the world unfold. That's what's at stake. So if you want to come and you feel you need to be there, be in touch and we'll work it out. Banavshay, why don't you give us a closing and we'll say goodbye. And then we'll meet again next month for another conversation about a different aspect. Banavshay.
Thank you. Everyone, I ask you to bring your hands onto your hearts and let us give thanks for being here in this extraordinary time of potential. Let us give thanks for a community of like-hearted, like-minded people who's coming together to create the world we want to live in and live for the generations to come. A world in harmony with the greater earth and greater cosmic community. And remember, we must become in our lives the things we choose to experience in the world. If we want a world of love, peace, balance, and unity, we must become those things in our own lives and live them to the best of our ability, day in and day out. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Apila. Thank you all for joining us. We'll talk next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.